Welcome back, everyone, and we're finally here. We're at the end of the month of Ifrit, talking about one of the most well-known games in the Final Fantasy franchise, the game that put JRPGs in the mainstream. We are talking about the one and only Final Fantasy VII. I'm not gonna lie, this is an intimidating video, if not simply for the history of the game made. This will be as spoiler-free as humanly possible, as always, so let's talk about the production that leads into Final Fantasy VII. The transition from Super Nintendo to PlayStation is one of the largest, most defining moments in the industry itself. We began talking this month looking at the often mistakenly called Final Fantasy VI for the Nintendo 64. In reality, of course, it wasn't a remake, it was just a tech demo that Square was trying to get the feel for the 3D environments, and this tech demo was called Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game. But I'd like to start a little bit further back than that. Let's look at Square coming hot off the heels of Final Fantasy VI, which was the masterpiece of their company at the time. There's a ton to talk about with the industry and how Square was involved at this point, even before we get into the proper Final Fantasy VII game itself. So let's go ahead and look back at the history and see how it shaped this massive company that we know today. There's a bunch of interesting articles out there. Polygon has a pretty good one with a bunch of people interviewing and giving their overall opinions on it. And I'm going to take those and try and condense them down and give you the least you need to know about this. So it's all very interesting, and I'll put a link in the description below. This point in video gaming history was probably the most defining of any since its inception of games. After the Genesis and Super Nintendo were on the way out, we had another big entry into the ring, and though there were a bunch of different companies, like always, Atari, Jaguar, I guess, if you want to call that competition, whatever, but we had the Neo Geo as well. Those paled in comparison to the two big ones, Nintendo and Sega. But now we have a company who just struck it big with their Walkman and Discman innovations, along with other prominent electronics, trying to make their way in the world in this video gaming realm that they had no clue what to do with. And that, of course, was Sony. Initially, Sony was going to team up with Nintendo to produce a disc-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, and needless to say, it never worked out for a number of reasons. But one of the biggest that I've seen is that the monetary compensation for Nintendo's mascots was essentially what held back that new platform. But you can find information about that, anywhere else. It's not really important to this story, but it is important to just lay that foundation for the groundwork that we're going to lead to Final Fantasy VII. After that big split, Sony decided to, just take its own concept and create its own system that we now know as the Sony PlayStation. This was revolutionary as it used CDs, which could be manufactured so much quicker than cartridges, and whenever you compare them, it basically had an almost infinite amount of space compared to like a Super Nintendo cartridge, and that's one of the reasons that they went the way that they did. Along with the CDs, Square also had just this amazing foresight to see where the industry was going in that direction. It's important to really drive home the point that the CG demo was incredibly profound in the way that it paved and showed what could be done with these new hardwares that were coming out. Final Fantasy VII is said to have actually begun planning way back in around 1994 for the Super Nintendo. Normally, right before a company is going into the last stretch of finishing a game, they will go ahead and start doing preliminary work on their next iteration. They wanted to play it safe, sticking with the traditional 2D pixel art style, and in fact, what I found was incredibly interesting that one of the original pitches for Final Fantasy VII would actually be a proper sequel to the latest hit, Final Fantasy VI. Now, we've never even heard anything about even a mention of a sequel since then, but apparently that brainstorming session lasted about 3 months or so before they decided against it, and it really never got past that planning stage. And there were a few initial concepts that began, but not much more work was done in that particular realm. However, one of the really big reasons for its abandonment was that Chrono Trigger was taking a little bit longer than they expected to get out, so the 20, 25, 30 people that were working on this preliminary Final Fantasy VI sequel, Final Fantasy VII, were all shuttled to help with the completion of Chrono Trigger, and well, it was the right call because that's a goddamn masterpiece, so good for them. Anyway, after the completion of Chrono Trigger, they set their sights back on Final Fantasy and began experimenting with some of the new technology that was coming out. And this particular point is actually when the Final Fantasy VI CG game comes in, and as such, it cemented what the developers wanted out of the next Final Fantasy game. They could play it safe, or they could gamble it all. They could go with the tried and true 2D sprites, or they could roll the dice and bet on this new system, the Sony PlayStation, that was unproven, and they could discard discard all of the safe pixel art that they've known since they basically began creating games and take that step into the wild frontier that was 3D environments of this next coming generation. So what did they do? Well, of course, they bet it all and obviously won. But it was more than just creating that masterpiece of a game that Square found itself with. Square not only created the game, but essentially thrust the brand Sony PlayStation to the top of the video game world. It was basically a perfect storm, and the footprint of Square can be seen today with the prominence of the PlayStation brand. I cannot stress enough how much of an impact this had. If Square never decided to experiment with 3D or decided to develop for the Nintendo 64, I am confident that gaming today would be completely unrecognizable. That's how much of an impact that decision to go and dabble in that 3D technology demo had. So after Chrono Trigger was released, work officially began in 1995 with about 120-ish workers looking at Final Fantasy VII, which was the largest team that any kind of game had ever known at that particular time. And you have to remember, not only were these people creating the game, but they would be the first of the major effort of supplementing the game itself with CG scenes throughout. This was completely unknown territory. So who was working on the game? Who actually developed Final Fantasy VII? There's a lot of people, I'm not going to go through all of them, but we'll talk about the big ones. So the prominent developers, as you would expect, we have seen in most of the Final Fantasy games in years past. The director solely was Yoshinori Kitase, who should sound familiar, we've talked about him quite a bit before. And interestingly enough, Hironobu Sakaguchi left that role entirely to Kitase, as Sakaguchi wanted to get in the bull's pen and actively help develop the game with a hands-on approach rather than just delegate the direction of it to others. There seems to be many factors that led toward this decision, but the two major points I think I want to highlight, that this is the transition moving forward with the new shift in technology. I'm sure Sakaguchi, as a leader of the company, wanted to have some hands-on with the tools that would help shape and define the industry in the decades to come. Secondly, and probably most importantly, is the tragedy that he had to endure while he was working on the previous Final Fantasy game. He recently lost his mother, and as all artists do, they use that tragedy to fuel their passion, driving them forward. I don't really want to get much into that here, but if you play the game, you can see that this tragedy has affected every single facet of the game. Look at all the characters, listen to the music. All of that came from this passion to show life and death and sorrow and love. If you want to know more about this, I will definitely point you to That One Video Gamer's YouTube page, also known as The Completionist, where they did a mini-series on all the Final Fantasy VII stuff, similarly to what I've done here, but they did it much more in depth about the loss and life aspect of Final Fantasy VII. So aside from that, the subject of the physical visual art was a pretty huge shakeup as well, as Amano wasn't the main artist for this game due to other extraneous issues. Amano did create some promotional art, his particular style, but that was pretty much his extent of the reach on this game. This allowed Yusuke Naora and Tetsuya Nomura to step up and try their hand at being the main artistic development. Of course, this would really help the jumping off point of Nomura, as we've talked about quite a bit recently, who is basically now one of the foundational members of Square Enix, as far as their artistic vision is concerned, especially nowadays. Musically, we have, of course, Nobuo Uematsu, and while I can tell you how amazing the music is, it would just be beating a dead horse right now, right? Like, the man can do no wrong. But beyond that, of simply amazing songs, moving to this new system actually allowed for more space and more depth of music creation. Uematsu could create a broader range of music with more resources available to him. As a result of this freedom that he had, we have our first huge hit, and I mean massively huge hit, of a Final Fantasy song with one of the most well-known songs, One Winged Angel. Much of it due to the decent quality of digitized choir voices. Nothing like that had ever been done on this scale before in video games. Later, we would see Uematsu take full control of the music with CD quality sounds rather than digital instruments, but here, regardless, this was a huge step. So that's pretty much the general lead up to Final Fantasy VII. It wasn't just another game, it quite literally was industry defining. And whatever preferences you have about the content of the game, you have to give it respect for what it did and how it left the mark on the industry. So with that being said, let's move on and take a look at the game itself. Final Fantasy VII really does feel like an evolution of Final Fantasy VI in the way that you would expect any game to evolve. And at this point, we would settle down into what would be a kind of familiar place of what we began to call Final Fantasy. Much like the previous game, we have a setting that's quite far from a traditional high fantasy setting, and it relies on a sort of modern magical aesthetic, which is very, very original, at least for the time. The world contained magic and swords and soldiers and ninjas and guns and trains and summons and sci-fi elements and mega corporations and metropolis cities, and it was just all blended together here with stories that took more twists and turns than you could possibly imagine. The game also has a sort of overbearing pressure that you constantly feel pushing you forward. It's a sort of looming threat that's palpable throughout. This, of course, is done with a masterful blend of a melancholy story paired together with the somber tone of Uematsu's music. Now, that being said, the gameplay itself is nothing insanely new as far as battle mechanics are concerned, save for the way that magic works. The battle system is still largely that of active time battle, which we saw in Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI. The one major addition, though, would be limit breaks, which a form of actually did appear in Final Fantasy VI, but happened so rarely that you could play the entire game and never even know that that was a thing in there. In fact, I didn't even know until, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. Like, I just didn't know about it. Limit breaks themselves can be seen in the franchise going forward. They're often called different things, but essentially what happens is you fill up this bar whenever you're attacked or damaged, or whatever particular way fills up the bar. You could acquire them periodically by using them more often, and many of the final limit breaks would require a side quest or something to obtain. Those final limit breaks are truly a spectacle to behold, especially Cloud's Omni Slash. The battles themselves took place entirely on a 3D battlefield with a moving camera, so you get a bunch of different camera angles to highlight and focus on the attacks of the party members and enemies. This is just mind-blowing stuff here. And before I move on from the battles, I do have to mention one brand new thing about the way in which the battles themselves are fought, and that is the fact that we only have 3 maximum party members at any given time, whereas before normally it would be 4, or even in the case of Final Fantasy IV, we would have 5 party members. So this reduction to 3 would be the standard for many of the games going forward. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Apart from the battle system itself, the way that the characters are handled and the way that they grow in Magic are pretty different. Maybe not necessarily the levels, but magic in Final Fantasy is usually changing, especially in Final Fantasy VI. You got magic in a pretty interesting way. Here is something similar. So magic in this game's a huge deal as it's intimately tied to the story as well as the mechanics of the game. Magic is held by what is known as materia, which is basically the game's crystals. They're little crystallized orbs of solidified Mako, which Mako is literally the liquid life stream of the planet. In fact, the usage of this Mako energy is actually what begins the game's story and pushes you throughout. But I'll get into that in a little bit whenever we briefly talk about the story. So materia itself is used by equipping it to your weapons, and there are 5 types of materia in Final Fantasy VII. Actually, that's not exactly true. There are a few other special ones, but I'm not going to be talking about that specifically just for story purposes. But anyway, the 5 generally fall into these categories. We have green, which is for magic. It's your classic fire, ice, lightning, all that kind of stuff. Red materia is summon materia, where you can summon these magical beings, and they are so impressive to watch. It was a big draw for Final Fantasy VII, seeing these different summon animations. They were just leaps and bounds over anything that we had seen before. Next up, we have command materia, and that would be a yellow materia, and it actually does what it says. It gives you special commands like stealing or using an enemy's skill, things like that. Blue materia is support materia, which if your weapon has any link slots, you could use to apply that support effect to the particular materia that it's with. For instance, if you had an all materia, like a blue materia that was an all, you could link it with fire magic, so whenever you use that fire magic, it would affect all of the enemies. Otherwise, it would only affect one if you didn't have that all materia. Last, there are independent materia, which are kind of pinkish purple, and they provide stat boost and other passive effects like that. Since materia is magic based, when it's equipped, your magical prowess goes up, you get more MP, but you do have the trade-off because it does bring your physical characteristics down quite a bit. Little anecdote, just personal, I actually never knew this when I was a kid, so I was just like, equip all of the materia. So that probably made the game much harder in retrospect, but it wasn't that bad, I'd beat it. Anyway, one important thing to note about materia here is that this is only distinct to Final Fantasy VII, the game, because if you go and look at any of the other expanded compilation games, color has absolutely nothing to do with what the materia's function is. And that is actually a really bothersome aspect for me personally, but just be aware. In Final Fantasy Advent Children, the summoned materias are not red. So, it would be good to have that continuity, but we don't. All right, so we've talked about how the game works, how the battle system operates, how the magic works. Let's get into the characters themselves and then talk about the story just briefly. Final Fantasy VII has much fewer main cast members than what we saw in Final Fantasy VI. That being said, these characters are some of the most complex and fleshed out in a Final Fantasy game up to this time, or you could even argue even up until now. In this case, it's absolutely quality over quantity. Now, whether you like that quality or not is up to you, but it's clear that they really focused in on giving these characters a lot of personality and backstory and character arcs. All in all, there are 9 characters and a few of them are optional, so let's just start with the ones that aren't and then we'll go and see where we get to. We gotta begin at the beginning, the one and only Cloud Strife. Cloud Strife is ubiquitous in video games these days. Cloud is an ex-soldier in the Shinra army, and Shinra is this big power mega corporation that's kind of like a nation in and of themselves. It's really weird. But Cloud used to work for them, and he's a pretty lean character in the way that he's skinny, but obviously he's incredibly strong. He has green eyes. They make a very big point of that for story reasons. Cloud's arc is a defining arc in that it's one of inward discovery about who he is as a person. Aside from his spiky hair, Cloud's defining attribute is his absurdly massive Buster Sword that he has. At the beginning of the game, Cloud is said to be 21 years old, which is actually a bit older than most JRPG protagonists, and he's also actually pretty short, coming in at only 5'7". And other than that, since I don't want to get into the story very heavy here, I'm just going to leave it there. Even if you hate RPGs, chances are you know exactly who Cloud is. Next up is Cloud's childhood friend and love interest of Tifa Lockhart. First we meet Tifa. She's running a bar known as the Seventh Heaven. Tifa is part of the resistance known as Avalanche, fighting against the evil Shinra company, and Tifa appears in Final Fantasy VII at the age of 20 with dark brown hair and red eyes most of the time. Sometimes in the other games they kind of messed that up, but she formally does have red eyes. She wears tank tops and shorts. In this game she would be classically known as a monk since she uses her fists to fight, but Final Fantasy VII really doesn't have a proper job system to speak of. Tifa is always Cloud's optimistic side, and she's dedicated much of her life in doing good for anyone around her, and that includes the planet, no matter the cost. And alright, so I cannot get to this point without talking about Tifa, and I have to say she was a defining point of many young males' video game crush. I know it's stupid, but if you grew up in the 90s and you played Final Fantasy VII and you were coming into your early teens, there was a good chance that you had a huge crush on Tifa, and I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, aside from Tifa, we have the leader of Avalanche, known as Barrett Wallace, who's actually not the first black character in a Final Fantasy game. That honor goes to General Leo in Final Fantasy VI. But of course, Barrett is the most prominent character of color in the entire franchise and is a complete badass, like just through and through. I don't think anyone argues that. Barrett's actually really much older at an age of 35, and he's a massive man with a height of 6'4", and his defining characteristic, of course, is his amputated hand, which is now replaced by a Gatling gun. And the reason for that is super interesting, so definitely play the story to find out about that. He fights for Marlene, his daughter, and he's trying to basically make the world better for her generation. Next up, we have Eris Gainsborough, another love interest of Cloud, completing the confusing love triangle, maybe rectangle, of Cloud, Tifa, Eris, and if you played it before, you may know what I'm talking about, but kind of Barrett as well. But I'll leave that there. Before I go any further, I want to address that name of Eris, and I think it requires conversation. So there are two kinds of people in this day and age. People that call her Eris, and people that are wrong. Not really, alright? So the people that call her by her official translation of Aerith, you're right, that's fine, I don't. I think it's stupid to call her that, and if I'm wrong, that's fine. I know I'm wrong, but I cannot call her Eris. It already sounds like I have a speech impediment, and Aerith, I won't do that, I'm sorry. So if I'm wrong, so be it, but she will always be Eris to me. Anyway, we meet Eris as a flower girl in the slums of Midgar, and she runs into Cloud, Aeris is pretty much the main character of the overall Final Fantasy VII story, and I'm talking about everything in Final Fantasy VII. It all revolves around Aeris. She is pretty much the nexus of the whole thing. And for the one person out there that doesn't know the importance of her and her impact on this game, RPGs, and basically video games in general, I'm not going to spoil it here, but suffice it to say, she is the de facto white mage of the game, and she is the soul of the series. Aeris is a year older than Cloud at 22. She wears a pink dress with some kind of weird red top, and she wields a staff and is basically awesome all around. Aeris is one of my favorite characters, which makes me sad, but I'd argue that of all the franchise's stories, the importance placed upon Aeris dwarfs any other character's importance in their particular game. She also has a completely 100% useless white materia that definitely does nothing at all and is no part of the story whatsoever. Let's go ahead and move on. We have some strange characters coming up now. We have the one known as Red 13, or more properly Nanaki, who is a lion wolf type of character. Almost looks like a Pokemon. He has bright red fur and a tail lit with fire. He's kind of a mysterious character, being a descendant from this ancient race. That's pretty much it. I mean, they don't really give you a lot of his character in any of the games, and it's pretty hard to get a grasp on him due to that. We do know, though, that he's super honor bound, more so than pretty much anyone else in the game, and if this game had jobs, he would be a knight, which would be weird, but he's just super driven by honor. And also with this character, he's very Native American type of themed character as well. That's pretty much all I have to say about Red 13. He's a super weird character. Next up, we have an even weirder character, which is known as Cait Sith, and he is a giant toy cat riding around on a giant toy Moogle. I can only assume the developers were completely stoned whenever they came up with this character. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just so out of left field. There's not a lot more I can say about Cait Sith without revealing much of his role in the game, and he does play a huge role in the game at various times, but I can't really go any further than that. The last of our major main story characters, we have the one and only Cid Highwind. If you've watched our Highwind video, you know that this character is the nexus of Final Fantasy lore. First, as has been the case since Final Fantasy II, he is this game's Cid. And with that, he is an angry redneck rocket scientist with a mouth on him that has a heart of gold. Not only that, he is a Highwind, so he carries a spear, and he has jump attacks, and he's basically a Dragoon. He's the Dragoon of this game if it had jobs. You really can't find a more badass character with as much lore connection in the entire franchise, so Cid Highwind is just awesome. The other two main characters aren't required for the story, but, you know, we gotta talk about them. And they're interesting in their own ways. First, we have Yuffie Kisaragi, or Yuffie, or however you want to say it. And she's the game's ninja, basically, and she's from the town of Wutai. And as the game picks up, there had been a war with Wutai going on, which is actually a big part of the Crisis Core prequel, and they had been at war with the Shinra Electric Company. Now, Yuffie has good intentions and cares deeply for her homeland, and she does whatever she has to kind of bring them back into prominence, and some of those things may be questionable, like stealing. She's a really big tomboy-ish character and spunky to no end. She's on the game's younger side at the age of 16, but other than that, her main defining feature is that she absolutely hates airships. She gets airsick on them. Next up is the last but not least, Vincent Valentine. It's probably the most important character that you can completely miss in the game. Vincent is a fan favorite and has received his own game since then with Dirge of Cerberus. Vincent has huge ties to major characters in the Final Fantasy VII universe, and he's essentially a vampiric character due to the, let's say, unpleasantness he has with Shinra in the past. He wields a gun and is kind of like a Van Helsing type of character who's a vampire. I don't know, it's super weird. He's a cool character and has just an incredibly insane background. Like, I don't know why he was an optional character, but if you want to get the full experience of Final Fantasy VII, you need to get Vincent. There are two other characters that I also want to talk about. First, I'll keep it brief, and that's going to be Zack. Zack is the main character of the prequel Crisis Core and directly leads into this game. Zack plays a pivotal role in Final Fantasy VII and deserves as much recognition as any of the main characters. Other than that, I really can't tell you much, but for all intents and purposes, he is a main character. And the last one that I want to talk about is the biggest character of the game, and that is Sephiroth. This man is synonymous with the word villain. Sephiroth, back in the day, redefined cool. Just as Cloud sits atop the greats with Mario and Link, Sephiroth sits with Ganon and Bowser. Sephiroth was the leading man and soldier, and he was unmatched by any. He was the hero until reasons happened. basically. He's a classic tragic character if there ever was one, and as a villain, this is really one of the first times in video game histories that we're given a villain in a game that has personal, very deep, heartfelt reasons instead of being pure evil just because why not. More so than any other reason, I believe fully that Sephiroth is the defining point of why Final Fantasy VII made the mark that it did in the gaming industry, above anything else, above graphics, the music, the main characters, all of that. To me, in my mind, whenever I see the fandom around Final Fantasy VII, all of that stuff is secondary to Sephiroth and the impact that he had on video games as a whole. Now, you can totally disagree with me, and you're probably right, but that's just what the feeling I get from him is. There are tons of other characters I could talk about all day long. A lot of the people from Shinra are incredibly important. There's the Turks as well, but this video can't go on forever. So maybe I'll do a top organizations or something later on down the line. So just to wrap up, let's talk about the plot as the game begins. So it starts with you on a mission as a mercenary paid to start this bombing run with Avalanche against the evil Shinra Corporation. So it's nothing really new in the grand scheme of things. Ever since Final Fantasy II, we've seen evil empires and resistance groups. However, here in Final Fantasy VII, it's been updated to fit its contemporary, modern-ish setting. The game has a unique style that really hasn't been matched since then. It was gritty and realistic. The fantastic parts of magic and life fit perfectly with the modern realism of it. So much that, honestly, you couldn't really have any part of the story one without the other, both the magical and mundane. Saying that, really, it's a game that today, as of this recording in July 2017, people are divided on. Some believe it's overrated, some think it's the best game ever. I can see both sides. Certainly, it's not my personal favorite by any means, but I'd be lying if I said I'd be into RPGs as much as I am now without this game. I do love Final Fantasy VII. It came out directly in the middle of my formative years and introduced some truly horrific scenes in the game, along with a very thought-provoking story in the way that no other story had exposed me to. It was incredibly thought-provoking. The game was a product of its era, and it pushed the video game medium to new heights with its intense focus on inter-character relationships, beautiful CG scenes that had never been done before, a unique magic system that was integral to the plot and not just the mechanics. It had some of the most memorable music ever, and it's no wonder why the game is still getting mentioned frequently, daily, even 20 years after its release. The game defined a generation of gamers, be it their first RPG ever or not. The impact was real, and it shaped the foundation of JRPGs and video games in general since then. It gave Nomura the credit he needed to advance in the company, in which turn he gave us the much beloved Kingdom Hearts series, and it guided Square Enix to where it is today, be it good or bad. Final Fantasy VII won so many accolades, and it's one of the industry's greatest achievements. For the games today that are successful in this genre, it's surely because they've stood on the shoulders of this giant. As we look towards August and the month of Titan, thank you so much for going on this journey with me. As always, these main entries into the Final Fantasy franchise are some of my most ambitious videos yet, and Final Fantasy VII is surely the most intimidating of all of these main videos. So take a moment with me as we send off Ifrit and watch the introduction to this masterpiece of a game.